Good morning, everybody. I hope I'm audible. And I hope my slides are visible as well. Um, all right, so I think we will wait for a couple of more minutes and then we will get started. All right, good morning. So what we are going to talk about today is it's a very, very crucial and very, very important topic, uh, which is called diabetes mellitus. As we all know, diabetes is now really a very, very major non-communicable disease that is seen worldwide, globally, as well as in our country as well. And in fact, we are also called the diabetes capital of the world because of the large numbers, sheer numbers of patients with diabetes mellitus who are there in India. Diabetes is a very complex disease. The diagnosis of diabetes has multiple connotations, and its ramifications are felt in almost all organ systems, and that gives rise to multiple problems which patients can face in when they have diabetes. So, although would have been better if we had a 1:1 class about discussing an approach to a patient with diabetes mellitus, what I'm going to show you in the next about 1.5 hours is what are all the concepts of diabetes mellitus? How do we suspect a patient having diabetes mellitus? What are the clinical manifestations of patients with diabetes? We will talk a little bit about how do you approach to a diagnosis of patients with diabetes, and of course, what is the further workup that we do in these patients. All right, so what we are going to do now is we are going to start with our presentation. So as we know that diabetes is on the rise, it's on the rise everywhere in the world. And worldwide, currently about 422 million adults have diabetes. That roughly translates to about 1% out of 11 persons in the world who is living has diabetes. 3.7 million people, in 3.7 million people, the deaths are directly related due to high blood sugar and diabetes mellitus. And overall, 1.5 million deaths are associated with diabetes. Diabetes, like I said, has multiple problems leading to multiple system involvements. Some of them can be life threatening, some can be limb threatening, and some of them can have multiple other comorbidities. Even in fact, if you know, remember that during the COVID outbreak, which is currently happening, patients who had diabetes mellitus were the ones who were having multiple complications. They had more severe disease, and they were the ones who were having a lot of complications, required higher oxygenations. And also, it is diabetics who have been found to have more incidence and prevalence of mucormycosis as a complication that is being seen now. So diabetes is a major public health disease. It has to be taken very seriously, and it is directly or indirectly associated with a lot of morbidity as well as mortality. If you look at what is going to happen to diabetes worldwide, as you can see everywhere in the next 25 to 30 years, if you take from 2020 to 2045, everywhere the number of diabetics are going to increase worldwide, and this is among the adult population. In North America, the increase is going to be about 33%. In Southeast Asia, which includes India, there is going to be a 74% increase in the number of diabetics seen in the world. Yes, in India, in Southeast Asia, from an estimated about 88 million in 2019 to almost 153 million by 2045. So also, as our population is aging and our population is growing older, we are likely to encounter more and more patients with diabetes mellitus, and these patients, because they live for a certain extended period of time, the complications and the diseases associated with diabetes are also quite long-standing. So what I'm going to talk to you about is basically from two very important associations or two very important clinical criteria that have been evolved to manage patients with diabetes. And the one of them is what is the very standard called the Standard of Medical Care in Diabetes, or the American Diabetes Association guidelines for the diagnosis management of diabetes mellitus. And the other one that I have taken these guidelines from are the Research Society for Study of Diabetes in India and the Endocrinological Society of India clinical practice recommendations for the management of type 2 diabetes mellitus 2020. So what I'm going to present in the next about an hour, hour and a half, is going to be an amalgamation of both of these guidelines. These guidelines, which some of them are Western data, and some of these guidelines that have been adapted by the Indian associations for use in Indian patients. And you will find that the slides will kind of tell you from where these guidelines have been derived. So the first question that comes to anybody's mind is, when do we start suspecting that a patient has diabetes mellitus? So it is important to remember that the diagnosis of diabetes, if you look at any standard textbook or any other standard text, is that there are classical triad of symptoms which everybody knows. And so it is very relatively easy to have a suspicion of diabetes or to make a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus when this classical symptom complex is present. And this symptom complex is because of the hyperglycemia, and it manifests as polyuria, polydipsia, polyphagia, and weight loss. Polyuria means excessive amount of urine. Polydipsia, because of the water loss, causes increased thirst. Polyphagia, because of hyperosmolarity and glycosuria. And commensurate, there is going to be an important weight loss. But there are other symptoms also which could make you suspect that patient could be having diabetes, and these include blurred vision. For example, an adult 40-45 who presents with blurred vision or blurring vision, or a patient who presents with neuropathic symptoms like lower extremity paresthesias or numbness. Men and women who present with candidal infections, balanitis in men, vaginal candidiasis in women, all of these may suggest a possibility of diabetes, and these are patients in whom you should get a blood sugar done to establish a diagnosis of diabetes. This one line is very important, and that is, many patients with type 2 diabetes are actually asymptomatic, and their disease remains undiagnosed for many, many years before they come to you. So these are some of the common symptoms that are seen. Patients end up feeling very tired or complain of unexplained fatigue. There is increased frequency of urination. Patients tend to pass urine again and again. There is sudden weight loss for which there is no reason that can be documented. There can be wounds or ulcers or other kind of skin lesions that don't heal. There can be sexual problems. There can be difficulty in erection, in ejaculation. So there can be problems in sexual function that can alert you to the possibility of an autonomic neuropathy that happens in these patients. These patients of polyphagia, they're usually complaining of increased hunger, but despite having increased hunger and increased intake of food, these patients tend to lose weight. They can have blurred vision. There can be numbness or tingling of the hands or feet, suggestive of a neuropathy. And there is polydipsia. And like I said, there can be vaginal infections in these patients. But it is very, very important to remember this, that many times diagnosis of diabetes is made just randomly. Either a patient goes in for a surgery or goes in for a routine blood test or goes in for an annual checkup, and there the patient is picked up to have an abnormal blood sugar report. That is one of the very important ways in which these patients are detected or diagnosed to have diabetes mellitus. And also sometimes patients can directly present with one or the other acute or chronic complications of diabetes mellitus, which again alerts you to the possibility that patient has diabetes. So it is a very wide spectrum of clinical conditions that makes you alert to the possibility that the patient could be having diabetes. So let us look at the classification and diagnosis of diabetes. So how do you classify diabetes, and how will you diagnose that patient actually has diabetes? So the most important two types of diabetes mellitus, which all of you are aware of, the first is type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disorder caused by an autoimmune destruction of the beta cells. That leads to an absolute insulin deficiency. And since it is autoimmune, it has associations with other autoimmune diseases as well. Type 2 diabetes is what was earlier called adult onset diabetes. It is usually due to a progressive loss of beta cell function associated with a very, very prominent component of insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is a very important physiological or pathophysiological marker of type 2 diabetes. So these are the two main types of diabetes. But in addition, there are other specific types of diabetes which may happen due to other causes. For example, you have some of the monogenic diabetes syndromes, like, for example, maturity onset diabetes of the young, which is also called MODY. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 different types. Then there are diseases of the exocrine pancreas. For example, patients who have chronic pancreatitis, they end up losing their beta cell function and they end up having diabetes mellitus. There can be some drugs, for example, patients who are on long-term steroids, they can have impaired glucose tolerance and then can manifest overt diabetes. And of course, there is a very important component of or a class of diabetes which is called gestational diabetes mellitus, which is noticed for the first time during a pregnancy, especially in the second or third trimester of pregnancy, and that sometimes settles down after the pregnancy is over, or sometimes may carry onwards to manifest as overt diabetes after this is after the pregnancy is over. So these are the main types of diabetes that we see. In adults, usually we see patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus, but there are many situations where young children who have been diagnosed as diabetes at a younger age continue to present into adult age with some with type 1 diabetes as well. And of course, we see many patients with other complications, other conditions such as cystic fibrosis, chronic pancreatitis, which can manifest as diabetes mellitus. So let us look at when do you say a patient has diabetes mellitus. So when we say a patient has diabetes mellitus, is the criteria for diagnosis of diabetes mellitus is either of these three. Any person or any adult with a fasting plasma glucose of more than or equal to 126 milligram per deciliter, fasting being defined as no caloric intake for at least 8 hours prior to the test, or a 2-hour postprandial recording of more than 200 milligram per deciliter after a 75-gram glucose load, or any other oral agent which is giving rise to a similar kind of glycemic response, or any person who has an glycosylated hemoglobin of more than 6.5%. And of course, it is very, very important to remember that this test should be performed under standard lab conditions, because there is a lot of variability in the HbA1c report. Any person who has the classical symptoms of hyperglycemia, that is polyuria, polydipsia, or polyphagia, even a random plasma value of more than 200 milligram per deciliter is enough to make a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus. The Indian guidelines also suggest that diabetes can be diagnosed with any of these three following criteria: a fasting plasma glucose of more than equal to 126 milligram per deciliter, or a fasting more than 126 and or a 2-hour postprandial of more than 200 milligram per deciliter, an HbA1c of more than 6.5%, or a random blood value of plasma glucose more than 200 milligram per deciliter in the presence of classical symptoms. In asymptomatic individuals, for example, somebody who has just gone in for an annual checkup or is otherwise asymptomatic, any single abnormal test should have to be repeated to confirm the diagnosis unless the result is equivocally abnormal. For example, if somebody has a fasting blood sugar of say 140 and the patient is completely asymptomatic, you would like to repeat the test say in about 4 weeks time or 2 weeks time. But somebody who has a fasting plasma glucose of 500 or 400, of course, there the diagnosis becomes unequivocal. So maybe in that situation, we would not like to repeat the test. But in all other situations, a single test, any of these, if a patient is asymptomatic, it's always better to repeat that test. So now comes the question, which blood? We all have seen that all these blood values that have been given is a fasting plasma glucose. So most labs, if you would go and get a blood sugar test done, they would do a fasting plasma glucose unless they specifically mention. For example, some labs will say this is a whole venous sample or this is a capillary blood sample. So you should know what is the correlation between a capillary blood sample and a fasting plasma glucose, and a whole venous blood sample and fasting plasma glucose. For example, the tests that you do using a glucometer, using some dextrose sticks or glucose sticks, These measure capillary blood. So you are taking a stylet, giving a little puncture, and just taking out some capillary blood, using it on a dextro sticks or a glucose sticks, and measuring the blood sugar. So that blood sugar that you measure with the help of a glucometer is actually capillary blood. And it is important to remember that capillary blood sugar yields values which are 7% higher than venous blood. All right. And whole blood also determines values which are usually 15% lower than the plasma or serum values. So if a person's, so you must have this idea about correlation of what test has actually been done on the patient. So you should look at the report and see whether it is actually a fasting plasma glucose, or is it a fasting whole venous glucose, or is it a fasting, for example, capillary glucose. So you must have an idea that plasma glucose measures are definitely higher than whole venous blood glucose, and that is something that you may need to keep in mind. And also, even in the fasting state or a postprandial state, there is some variation which is seen in the capillary values of blood sugar. So now, since diabetes is such a major problem and it is emerging now to be one of our largest and the most important non-communicable diseases in the country, and we are having such a large number of population which is turning out to be diabetic, the stress is now on screening early and detecting early diabetes mellitus. So everybody who is a healthcare provider must have their own plan, and there should be a national plan and a national guideline or a framework for diagnosing to detect patients with diabetes mellitus early. And that, of course, depends upon the lot of things. And we must also think, whom should we start screening for diabetes? We are a population of 125 crores. Should we screen everybody for diabetes mellitus? No, that has to be dependent on the prevalence of diabetes in the country, the support of the healthcare system which is there, whether our healthcare system will be able to do it or not, and whether we'll be able to treat all those patients who are detected to be diabetes. So all these things should be kept in mind before we launch any kind of screening program. However, if you are running your own practice, or you are running a small hospital, or your hospital has its own policy, at least anybody who presents to a healthcare setting at any point of time should be screened for diabetes. Irrespective whether the patient comes in for surgery, whether the patient comes to get his tooth extracted, whether the patient is coming for any random cause to the hospital, presentation to a hospital or a healthcare setting is an opportune moment to test the person for diabetes, and not testing anybody who comes into the healthcare system is like a very important missed opportunity. All family members of diabetics must be tested, because especially type 2 also tends to run in families. All women who are coming in for antenatal care, that is, are pregnant, should be tested. Anybody who comes in for dental care must be tested. There are a whole spectrum of dental disorders that are associated with patients with diabetes, and so that's again a very important moment when you can test the general population for diabetes. Any overweight children or adolescents at the onset of puberty, that also may indicate insulin resistance, and so you need to test them also for diabetes. And also, wherever feasible, community screening may be done. You have seen so many times that in so many places you have what are called these diabetes screening camps, where randomly people are just invited to get a blood sugar done, and at all these places a random blood sugar is done. It could be done with the glucose sticks also, and they are provided with a value. If the value is abnormal, they're also provided information that you need to go and consult a doctor. So it may not be ideal, but at least you're screening so many patients or so many people, not patients, at one given point of time. So it is actually a community screening. So the more and more community screening programs are held, the more and more we will be able to identify and detect asymptomatic diabetics. You see, patients who are symptomatic, people who are symptomatic will always present to the healthcare system anyways. Our aim is to detect the presence of diabetes mellitus in persons who are asymptomatic. So that is why these require the presence of screening programs. So how do you detect these patients? So first of all, there has to be two things that have to be done. You have to identify the high-risk individuals by a high-risk assessment questionnaire, and then you do the glycemic measures in these high-risk patients. So the RSSDI panel suggests that 6.5, more than 6.5% is the optimal level for diagnosis of diabetes. However, in India, it cannot be used as the sole measurement. it is more because there may be other reasons for having a inadequate or a poor correlation between hemoglobin values and glycemic values. So it is always recommended that screening should always be done with one or the other risk factors. For example, like I said, first degree blood relatives with diabetes, patients who are persons who belong to high risk ethnicity, for example, Asian Americans are at a higher risk for developing diabetes. Patients who have had a history of cardiovascular disease, hypertension. All hypertensives must be detected for diabetes, and all diabetics must be checked for hypertension. Patients who have low HDL cholesterol or a high triglyceride level on some lipid estimation. Women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome, again, a manifestation of insulin resistance. Patients who are extremely obese or otherwise having physical inactivity, and some other manifestations of insulin resistance, such as severe obesity, acanthosis nigricans, and certain other markers. All women who were diagnosed with gestational diabetes should have lifelong testing at least every 3 years. And so on the basis of this, you can classify patients into diabetes or pre-diabetes. Now, this concept of pre-diabetes has come in a little recently, and it identifies those patients who are not diabetic by the conventional classification system of diabetes. However, these are patients who don't have normal glucose tolerance as well. So these are people whose fasting blood sugar is between 100 to 125 milligram per deciliter. That is called impaired fasting glucose. Or anybody who has a 2-hour postprandial value after a 75 gram oral GTG between 140 to 199, which is called an impaired glucose tolerance, or they have an HbA1c value of between 5.7 to 6.4. If a person qualifies into either of these three, the person gets classified as pre-diabetes. Pre-diabetes increases the risk of manifestation as overt diabetes in the future. Patients with pre-diabetes themselves are at increased risk for cardiovascular events and increased mortality and risk compared to the general population. So that is why this group of patients is very important to recognize and act upon. So there are these screening tests. This is the American Diabetes Association screening test to detect your level of diabetes. There are two risk scores which have also been developed for the Indian population. One has been developed by the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation, and the other is by Ramachandran et al. And these are very simple tools. For example, this is the Indian Diabetes Risk Score. There are some parameters like age, waist circumference, physical activity, and a family history of diabetes, and each of them are scored. A minimum score is 0, the maximum score is 100. Anybody who has a score of more than 60 has a high risk for diabetes and should be screened for diabetes mellitus. Gestational diabetes mellitus is a very important topic, and I'm not going to cover it because it gets covered extensively in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. However, I would just like to tell you that any woman who comes in for an antenatal checkup at any time must be tested for diabetes, because ideally you should test them at between 24 to 28 weeks of gestation, and you must do it with an oral glucose tolerance test, because the presence of impaired glucose or gestational diabetes mellitus has very serious ramifications not only for the mother but also for the unborn child. The child can have multiple complications like large for age. There can be incidents of other birth dysocias. So there are hypoglycemias. So there are multiple complications that can happen in the children as well. That is why all women who come to you during an antenatal period must be checked for diabetes mellitus. And also, anybody who has had evidence of or history of gestational diabetes in the past should be have lifelong screening for diabetes, because these women are at higher risk for developing overt diabetes in the future. There are two methods by which you can do oral GTT for diagnosis of gestational diabetes mellitus. I'm not going into the details. One is a 75 gram oral glucose tolerance test, and the other is a 50 grams glucose tolerance test. And we will talk about this later when we are going to when our gynecologist colleagues teach you about gestational diabetes mellitus. So now we have talked about screening. Let us see how can we prevent or delay the type 2 diabetes in patients. So it is important that in all those with pre-diabetes that we classified, there should be annual monitoring for these patients to look for the development of type 2 diabetes mellitus. So anybody who is pre-diabetic at any diagnosis should be screened annually to look whether or not overt type 2 diabetes mellitus has developed or not. Lifestyle behavior change for diabetes prevention has to be provided and has to be referred for all patients who are pre-diabetes, and you should try and aim and achieve 7% 7% weight loss of the initial body weight, and there should be an increase in moderate intensity physical activity such as brisk walking to the tune of at least 150 minutes per week. In patients who are having pre-diabetes, especially those with a BMI of more than 35 kilogram per meter square, or those with age more than 60 years, or women with a prior history of diabetes mellitus, one may consider giving metformin in these patients, but this is a very, very individualized decision that has to be taken only for these three groups of patients. Anybody else with pre-diabetes does not need to be put on pharmacological therapy or pharmacological intervention. So like I said, pre-diabetes also puts the person at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease and death, and therefore any other modifiable risk factors such as dyslipidemia should be assessed and taken care of, especially blood pressure also. So let us look at what are all the comprehensive medical evaluation and assessment of comorbidities that one would like to do in patients who present with diabetes mellitus. So it is very important to remember that whatever we are going to do with the patient, that is get done, do some physical evaluations or advise some kind of interventions, whether they are non-pharmacological or pharmacological, the approach has always to be patient-centered and it has to be collaborative care. It cannot be me or you sermonizing to a person that you have to do this, you have to eat this, you can't eat this, you must do this. It has to be a collaborative effort. The reason for this is that collaborative effort with a multidisciplinary team always gives better results, and collaborative care is likely to be more adhered to by the patient. Because it is important to remember, many times we have noticed this when we send patients across for dietary screening, evaluation, and a reference. The patient comes back with a diet chart which says you must eat chapatis made out of 500 grams of soya bean flour and combine it with 100 grams of atta and refined. The person says, look, I have never eaten this in my life. Why should I eat this? So one must always remember that patient preference, beliefs, patients otherwise access to information, and patients access to other things that you would like them to have, and what the patient is used to is very, very important, and that should be kept in mind before we advise all these things, which then if it is going to be difficult for the patient to follow, the patient is just not going to follow whatever you're going to do. So remember, there has to be a team that works with the patient consisting of nurses, dietitians, exercise specialists you may want, pharmacists, dentists, podiatrists, and of course, in some situations, you may even need the help of mental health professionals. This looks very complicated, but it is not. This is entirely what we need to do to help our patients who have diabetes mellitus. And so let's start with this circle of cycle for helping our patients with diabetes. The goals of care are two. Number one, we want to optimize the quality of life in these patients. So if they are detected to be diabetic, they should be living their optimum quality of life with the existing disease and its comorbidities and its complications. And if a patient does not have any other complications or has minimal complications, our major goal is to prevent development of other complications in these patients. And so to arrive at these goals of care, we must go through this cycle of intervention to help our patient. And remember, this decision cycle is always patient-centered. So the patient is at the center of this entire cycle of intervention. So the first thing we need to do is we need to assess key patient characteristics. We look at the patient's lifestyle. What does he do? Is he a sedentary worker? Is he a table worker? Is he working very hard? Is he a field worker? what is the lifestyle patient has, what are the associated clinical comorbidities, atherosclerosis, kidney disease, heart failure, what are the other clinical characteristics of the patient, the weight, height, age, what is the glycemic control currently, what is the socio-cultural context in which the patient is living. So this is the first thing that we do, that is we are assessing key patient characteristics or parameters. Then once we have assessed this and we have decided in our minds as to what is the kind of pattern or spectrum of disease and socio-cultural context that we are dealing with, then we will look at specific factors that may impact our decisions regarding interventions or treatment. We may need to individualize glycemic control goals. We have to always think about the impact of weight, age, and hypoglycemia when deciding on the interventions. We must always think about how well a patient would be able to adhere to a complex regimen. Do a patient need a simpler regimen? For an older patient, somebody who's 70 years old, giving a very, very complex regimen to the patient is not going to help you, because there may be very mild cognitive impairment also in that patient. So we need to take care of all of this. We need to choose a regimen that will optimize adherence and persistence with treatment. And one must always keep in mind the access, cost, and availability of medication. It is very easy to write very novel drugs which can be given as injections once a week. It is very good, you will get good glycemic control, but your patient may not be able to afford it. So that is something that always need to be kept on the back of your mind. Once you have decided clinically as a caregiver as to what kind of decisions that you have taken as far as treatment is concerned, then you need to share that with the patient and make sure the patient agrees to it. Once the patient agrees, kind of empower the patient, and you will give effective counseling regarding that. Then you and the patient agree on what are called SMART goals. They are specific, they are measurable, they should be achievable, they should be realistic goals, and they should be time limited. And so looking at all these in mind, you devise treatment goals. After you have devised and agreed with the patient on these treatment goals, you implement the patient treatment plan. And once you initiate the patient treatment plan, you should be seeing the patient every 3 months at least, till your patient has reached a stable level of control that you would like to achieve. During all this, you are continuing monitoring the patient and support the patient, including the emotional well-being, tolerability, and adverse effects to medications. You are monitoring patients' glycemic control, and you are doing other biomedical feedback, including self-monitoring blood glucose, weight, blood pressure, lipids, and all other lab monitoring that you do. At the end of the cycle, you review all the patient's goals, whether or not you have reached these goals, especially optimizing quality of life and maintaining glycemic control. And then if there are changes, again, you go back to the cycle and change whatever you need to change. And then you keep on going through this cycle again and again till you're able to maintain good goals. So this, in a gist or just in a summary, is how you're going to enter into a decision cycle for a patient-centered glycemic management in patients with type 2 diabetes. So always use empowering language that encourages patience, that's non-judgmental, that's neutral, it's based on facts, and it's free from stigma. All right, and use language that provides hope and belief and is very respectful to the patient. That goes true for all our communications with patients, but especially here, since it is a very chronic disease, it's not a 5-day medication patient has to take. Patient has to take this medication and follow our instructions and our these things for a period of at least for as long as possible. So we need to have our patient in our corner. We cannot afford to have patients not moving with us. All right, so it has to be kept that in mind. A comprehensive medical examination has to be done at initial visit A to confirm the diagnosis, classify. At the initial diagnosis, you must do all evaluations for all diabetes complications, because like I said earlier itself, diabetes complications may already be present when the patient comes to you for the first time, because diabetics may have hyperglycemia, which is asymptomatic for many years before they actually come into contact with the healthcare system. So it is very important to evaluate for diabetes complications and other potential comorbid conditions at the first visit itself. If the patient has been on any prior treatment when he comes to you, please review that. And you need to see whether any risk factors have been controlled or not in patients who already have established diabetes. And again, you need to formulate your plan. It is very important that diabetics come under the high risk group for vaccinations. So you must make sure that patients with diabetes receive their shots regularly. And let us look at the diabetes which vaccines which are recommended by the RSSDI. All adults should receive pneumococcal vaccine, which is a polysaccharide vaccine. All adults with diabetes should receive annual doses of influenza vaccine. Adults must receive one-time dose of Tdap, irrespective of the last tetanus shot the patient took, and then take a booster with TD every 10 years. And of course, for children, there is a whole lot of vaccines, MMR, varicella, zoster. For adults, for varicella can be given to prevent zoster in these patients. Nowadays, Hep B, Hep C are already there, and one needs to look at this whether or not patient has been vaccinated for the primary vaccination for Hep B, Hep A, and also HPV. Again, it is given in young girls, but again, you may need to reevaluate this if your patient has not received these. Many times you find patients who have type 1 diabetes have associations with other autoimmune diseases, especially celiac disease, autoimmune thyroiditis. So you need to screen them if there is any such possibility at the first visit. And if patients seem to develop this and later also, then also you should screen them for these autoimmune disorders. It is very important to see whether the patient has cognitive impairment, because diabetes mellitus itself can give rise to cognitive impairment due to multivascular or atherosclerotic vascular disease, which can give rise to small strokes, which can give rise to atherosclerosis, and then can give rise to hypoxic brain damage. And also, we need to know that because we need to make sure that whatever medications or treatment we are giving, we are making the risk of hypoglycemia very less in these patients. If you have an older patient who lives all by himself or herself without much social support from younger children, and also has, say, problems with visual acuity or diabetes related eye complications, then you need to tailor the medications very, very carefully in this group of patients. So it is very important to, at the initial period, assess whether cognitive impairment or even mild dementia is there in these patients. Many of our patients have obesity, have diabetes, and it's a very important factor for the presence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD. NAFLD now globally is the most important cause of chronic liver disease and end-stage liver disease worldwide. So it is important that you must assess these patients whether or not they have steatohepatitis. So if they have abnormal liver functions, then you will evaluate them for steatohepatitis. Fatty liver can be found in a lot of patients, and depending upon the degree of fatty liver, we need to take a call on what we need to do. So this is a table that is telling you what needs to be done at the initial visit of these patients. So you take a history of diabetes, you take a family history of diabetes, and you look for personal history of complications and common comorbidities, like example, obesity, obstructive sleep apnea, NAFLD. Check for the blood pressure, look for all other complications, look for hypoglycemia, do a dilated eye exam, look for any other specialist that patient may need to see, and all this needs to be done at the initial visit. Hypoglycemia awareness, if has happened, should be there at every visit. At every visit to a healthcare system, from all diabetics, you should inquire whether there has been an episode of hypoglycemia. Again, whether there has been any other referral or you need to refer the patient, you must do that at every visit. Otherwise, many of these things can be done annually in these patients once a patient is stable with diabetes mellitus. And of course, at each visit, you're going to look and review your treatment protocol. So you will again look at the behavioral factors, for example, substance abuse, tobacco abuse, any other thing, physical activity that you will do at the initial visit. And of course, physical activity and sleep, you will look at every visit. You will review medications at each visit, at baseline also, at each visit also, and also annually. And then you may need to look at some other things that you may prescribe if your patient is able to afford it and has assistance of technology with him or her. For example, glucose monitoring, whether the patient can use a glucose monitor, buy a monitor, do self-monitoring of blood glucose. It is always better for patients who are diabetic to be able to monitor their blood glucose with a glucometer. They should be told how to do it, but whether they can buy it, whether they can buy the glucose sticks is another matter entirely. And also you should look at whether they have adequate social networks and social support that will provide care and support to these patients. In a physical examination, at baseline, never forget to do weight, height, and BMI. It is extremely crucial because all our weight goals and BMI goals are directed after an assessment of the baseline goals. In children or in adolescents who have type 1 diabetes, please keep in their mind their growth and developmental needs and requirements. Remember, blood pressure measurement has to be done at baseline and at every visit in every patient with type 2 or type 1 diabetes mellitus. Fundus examination has to be done at baseline, repeated annually thereafter. All other evaluations for skin, for the thyroid, mental disorders, cognitive function, all this has to be done at baseline, and some of them you may repeat depending upon what is the requirement, but annually you will have to screen all of them again. You will do a whole lot of tests at baseline for a newly diagnosed diabetics, which will include tests for the diabetes, a lipid profile, a liver profile, a spot urine albumin to creatinine ratio to look for renal involvement, serum creatinine, and you will calculate the creatinine clearance rate. You can do a TSH in patients with type 1 diabetes, and if patients are already on medications, then you may need to do other tests as well. So this has to be done in baseline and then repeated every annually, but you may also have to repeat this test depending upon whether or not patient has any of these complications. All right. So once you have assessed the patient, you will assess these 3 or 4 very important things. That includes assess the risk of diabetes complications. You will look at the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, specifically ask whether the patient has history of heart failure. If the patient has chronic kidney disease, you will stage that, and you will look at any hypoglycemia risk. After you have done the initial assessment, you will set up a goal or a target for that patient, which will include a target HbA1c goal or a blood sugar target. And if hypertension is present, you will establish a hypertension target for these goals. You will advise therapeutic life management plans like lifestyle management, pharmacological therapy, and we will come to that in the next few slides. You may need to refer your patients to other specialists at baseline itself if you think any of these or others are present. A dilated eye exam or fundus exam at baseline is very important for all diabetics, so you will refer them to an ophthalmologist. If the woman is of reproductive age, the patient may need family planning advice, and so you would like to refer the patient to an obstetrician. A registered nutritionist for medical nutrition therapy is very important, and we'll talk about this in the next slides. You must provide diabetes self-management education support, and if you have a diabetes counselor available in your institution or hospital, please make use of that person. A dentist may be required to call in for comprehensive dental and periodontal examinations. If required, mental health professional may be required to provide appropriate care. So let's look at some behavior changes that has to be done, and that includes self-management education and support, and that needs to be done for all patients who come to you with diabetes mellitus. Let us now look at one very important aspect of diabetes care, that is medical nutrition therapy. So remember, if you are working in a small nursing home or you are working even in a primary health center, you may not have a trained dietitian or a nutritionist available with you. So the nutritional counseling can be provided by the healthcare provider himself or herself who has some minimal training in nutrition therapy. So all of us, by the time we finish our MBBS, should be able to provide some examples or some amount of counseling for patients who are diabetes. It's not necessary that you have a very highly trained nutritionist with you. If you have a nutritionist, fine, that is really nice, that is ideal. But otherwise, even then, you can provide simple counseling strategies to these patients. So the simplest thing that you need to advise to your patient is, overall, there has to be a reduced consumption of simple carbohydrates. Why simple carbohydrates and sugars? Because they have high glycemic index. They are very likely to manifest into high glycemic index. So fried foods, again, that is going to give rise to glycemic index and also will have complex lipids. And also avoid the consumption of complex carbohydrates. And one must advise higher consumption of complex carbohydrates and high proteins, because you're going to avoid the high glycemic index that can happen with simple sugars. Always, this is not only true for diabetes, this is true for everybody. Salt intake should always be in moderation. One must encourage increased duration and frequency of physical activity, especially if the person is leading a very sedentary life. And there should be a mass awareness campaign for healthy life and lifestyle, so that everybody benefits from this kind of advice and this kind of counseling. So let us look at what kind of diet plan can you offer the patient. So if you look, these are the most important components of any diet: carbohydrates, fats, proteins. So remember that out of the total caloric food intake, 50 to 60% should be carbohydrates only. Only 50 to 60% should be carbohydrates, because carbohydrates will give rise to increased glycemia, especially after intake of foods. Always prefer foods with low glycemic index and glycemic load. That is why simple sugars should be generally avoided. One should try and restrict the quality of rice in diet. This is what the RSSDI tells you. But remember, many patients are rice-based diets. So to tell them suddenly to stop rice and move on to a wheat-based diet is not going to work. So you have to be very, very guarded when you explain to them how they need to probably mix other diets in addition to rice. And there should be 25 to 40 grams of fiber intake per day. 30% of total calorie intake can be fats. Oil rotation is recommended. Sometimes you have mustard oil, sometimes you have vegetable oils. That is very important because it increases the kind of unsaturated fatty acid that goes on. Highly saturated fat foods should be avoided. Always try and take unsaturated foods with unsaturated fats in food, and saturated fatty acid should be less than 10%, and hydrogenated vegetable oils, which were earlier available, should be avoided. 15% of the total caloric intake should be proteins, but remember, one must always consider renal status before we advise a high protein diet, because it can have a more negative impact than good. Always tell your patients to limit red meat intake and prefer other sources of protein. So this consideration of protein has to be kept in mind. Diet rich in fruits, leafy vegetables, nuts, fibers, whole grains, and unsaturated fatty acids can be given. Artificial sweeteners, if patient needs to take, should be less than 2 to 3 grams per day. Patients have lots of questions regarding Splenda and other kinds of artificial sweeteners, and one needs to address those questions. Salt consumption should be less than 5 grams per day. Pulses, legumes, unprocessed vegetables, and low dairy fat are recommended. The commonest questions that you will find from patients who come to you in our clinic is, somebody has told me that I should take Karela, so I have now gone on to leaving all vegetables and I eat only Karela. Is it all right? So no, it is not all right. You have to have a good mix of vegetables in your diet. Karela may have other advantages or some benefits as seen in some situations, but that does not mean that one shifts entirely or all our vegetables into bitter gourd. Another thing, questions that patients commonly come up with is, which fruit can I eat? Can I eat a mango? Can I eat an apple? They will ask you one by one fruit. So remember, one medium-sized fruit, any fruit in moderation is allowed. A mango should not be taken as a whole because it has very high caloric content. So you need to cut down on mangoes. So when patients ask you questions, please try and answer as much as you can in simple terms, in the number of chapatis, in the bowls of rice, in bowls of dal. So please try and tell that to your patient in that language, which he or she can understand better. But always keep the socio-cultural context in mind before you give dietary advice. So the goals of nutrition therapy actually are, if the patient is not at ideal body weight, we must bring the patient to ideal body weight, and that body weight has to be maintained. That will entail a loss of body weight in many patients, especially those who are overweight or obese. We have to attain individualized glycemic, BP, and lipid goals. Remember, each patient is different. Each patient has different metabolism. Each patient has different age. So please remember, goals are there. There are certain recommendations and guidelines for everybody, but individual goals always have to be set. so as we are able to delay or prevent the complications of diabetes. It is very important to recommend physical activity to all adults, diabetic or not, especially those who are diabetics, especially type 1 and type 2 diabetes, should engage in at least 150 minutes or more of moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic activity per week. Moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic activity per week. This should be spread over at least 3 days in a week, and there should be no more than 2 consecutive days without activity. This is very important. So not more than 2 days patient should go without activity. Otherwise, every day to about 150 minutes per week activity, vigorous, moderate to vigorous activity is recommended. Younger people may do high intensity trainings or vigorous intensity trainings of lower time duration because they may be working on other things. So 75 minutes per week for younger person is also recommended if they are doing high intensity training or they are doing vigorous exercise. Otherwise, for moderate exercise, 150 minutes per week has to be recommended for all adults. Please keep this in mind. This is very, very important. Also, you should advise people with type 2 diabetes to decrease the amount of time spent in daily sedentary behavior. So prolonged sitting should be interrupted every 30 minutes. You can't have people just sitting in front of a, sitting on a couch in front of the TV doing nothing for hours together. That is not recommended. They should get up. They should even walk within their homes if walking outside is a problem, but they should not be sedentary at all. Flexible training, balance training. Yesterday was International Yoga Day, and yoga must be introduced into everybody's life because it increases flexibility, it increases balance, it increases muscle strength. Other forms of flexible trainings like Tai Chi may also be recommended, but again, remember, one must remember and one must keep in mind the baseline of the person before you advise such kind of exercises, and that has to be kept in mind when any kind of yoga is given to these or is advised to these patients. Sometimes in a zest to do so much of yoga, they end up doing exercises which they are not used to, and they may end up doing more harm than good. So please keep in mind that all these things, muscle training, flexibility exercises, should always be done keeping in mind what is the baseline, and one must always slowly build up upon this. Right. Anybody and everybody, smoking cessation has to be advised very, very strongly. They already have one very important cardiovascular risk factor, that is diabetes. If they add smoking to it, it is going to compound the problem by multiplicative means, not just additive. Any kinds of cigarette or tobacco use, even e-cigarettes, are not recommended for anybody, especially not for diabetes. So smoking cessation has to be part of your behavior change strategy, which you will tell your patient. Try and address psychological issues with an integrated aspect, with an integrated collaborative approach with your patient. But remember, sometimes it may be difficult for physicians to be able to provide that kind of a support, but at least we can identify it and then refer the patient to an appropriate person. Diabetics are at an increased risk for distress, for depression, for anxiety, for disordered eating, and also cognitive abnormalities. Keep all these in mind when you are providing care to patients who come to you. And you may need to refer your patient to a mental health provider or a specialist in case you notice any other problems in your patient, or you are not able to manage any of the common psychological patients that patient has. Let us look at the further things. What are the glycemic controls, or how much should the blood pressure control be in these patients? So when would you do an HbA1c? There are patients who come to us in the OPD and say every month they come to you with a HbA1c report. No, it's not required. Glycemic status, either A1C or any other glycemic measures, are recommended at least 2 times a year, especially in those patients who are stable glycemic control. So somebody has stabilized glucose and is doing well and has not had any complications and is otherwise well, maintaining his weight, maintaining his intake of medications and diet and nutrition. So that person needs to have an A1C done maybe once in 6 months, or maybe once in 4 months if you believe that once in 6 months is too much, but not more frequently than that. But in patients who are not meeting your glycemic goals, whose therapy is being reviewed and managed and revised by you at visits, that person should have a more frequent monitoring of glycemic status, and that has to be done at least quarterly, means 4 times in a month, 4 times in a year you may need to do it. You may need to monitor blood sugar more closely, but A1C need not be and does not have much value to be monitored beyond 8 weeks. So at least 8 weeks interval between the H1C monitoring, but blood sugar you can monitor much more frequently as and when required. The ideal A1C goal for many non-pregnant adults without any significant hypoglycemia is less than 7. So whatever treatment you have started, whether it is medical nutrition treatment, behavioral change, and pharmacological treatment, you must aim for an HbA1c less than 7. If you feel that lower than A1c less than 7 is acceptable, you may try giving it without significant hypoglycemia or other adverse effects of treatment. Meaning you can try for 6.5, which will be ideal, but less than 7 is optimal, because remember, achieving a target of less than 6.5 is very difficult and requires a lot of intensive changes on the part of the patient. Also, the risk of hypoglycemia becomes higher, especially in older patients. So one needs to modify that and keep that in mind before we decide on our A1C goals. So optimum A1C less than 7, ideal maybe less than 6.5, but if you're able to bring down A1C to less than 7, that is good enough for most of your patients. Less stringent control. If you feel that your patient is older, your patient has cognitive abnormalities, the patient has mild renal insufficiency, or the patient is having other problems, you may, in the interest of patient, bring down your glycemic goal from 7, bring it up to 8, less than 8, meaning you're opting for a less stringent control of sugar, looking at the overall picture of the patient. All right. And every time you look at your patient, you may reassess your glycemic targets depending upon the context at that point of time. So, patients, this is a graph that shows you what should be the how stringent should be your control of A1C. Patients who are having high risk of hypoglycemia and other drug adverse events, you will opt for less stringent control. Patients who are having very long standing diabetes because you expect that complications are going to be higher, you can go with less stringent control as compared to a newly diagnosed diabetic where you may want a better control. Where a patient is younger, you will have more stringent control, whereas a patient who is much older, you do not want to see very stringent blood sugar controls because the likelihood of complications is much more here as compared to somebody who's already 75. If there are important comorbidities, especially severe comorbidities, you're going to attain or you're going to achieve or you aim for less stringent control. If there are established vascular complications, again, you will aim for less stringent control. And of course, if your patient is highly motivated, excellent self-care capabilities, young patient, educated patient, has access and has access to information also and access to money and goods also, there you are likely to aim for more stringent controls compared to a poorer patient who's older, less social support. So there you may kind of modify and you may go ahead with something that is say 8% of glycemic target. So the summary of glycemic recommendations for non-pregnant adults with diabetes is you will aim for an HbA1c less than 7%. You will aim for a fasting capillary plasma glucose between 80 to 130 milligram per deciliter, and the peak postprandial control you will aim for less than 180. So you should try and keep the fasting between 80 and 130. You will try and keep the PP, blood sugar, less than 180. Again, you will look at the context and you will look at the comorbidities and associations with other factors before you decide on this. But this is the general goal that is recommended for most patients. Remember, hypoglycemia is a serious complication. Hypoglycemia is a more serious complication than somebody having a blood sugar of 250. All right. So even if your patient's blood sugar postprandial is 200, it has less risk as compared to somebody whose blood sugar is 50. So hypoglycemia is a definite risk, and one must keep it in mind before we address all other problems. And occurrence and risk for hypoglycemia should be reviewed at every visit, every encounter, and should be investigated. And you must always keep this in mind before you come out with a plan for your patient. Self-monitoring blood glucose. Anybody in whom you are advising insulin should always be advised self-monitoring of blood glucose with the help of a glucometer based on their insulin regimen. Ideal times for testing would be fasting, prior to a meal, at bedtime, prior to any exercise, whenever they think or they feel that their blood sugar levels are going low, and after treating somebody who is having hypoglycemia to attain normoglycemia. So there are multiple points in a day where a patient may be advised to do self-monitoring of blood glucose, again, depending upon context and depending upon the need. So you must keep this in mind. It is always better to train your patient how to use a glucometer. Ask the patient to buy a glucometer, or if has some insurance which gives access to a glucometer, buy or bring the glucometer. The patient must bring the glucometer to you at the next visit. Train the person how to use the glucometer, how to do a reading, how to check a reading. If you have a nurse or you have a trained diabetes educator, that person will help you with this. Otherwise, we ourselves can do all this for our patients, and we always tell our patients how to monitor, how to maintain a chart, how to read that chart, and when should a person get alarmed on seeing that chart. All right. So this is a very important concept of management in these patients. Why it is important is hyperglycemia has so many problems. Hyperglycemia can cause so many different physiological mechanisms, and that is why we need to monitor blood sugar in these patients. So now let us come to, in addition, let us now look at certain aspects of management in these patients. We will start with obesity management in these patients. Remember that one must do the BMI at baseline of all patients with type 2 diabetes, because we are going to have therapeutic options and management strategies for anybody whose BMI falls out of range. So anybody with a BMI between 25 and 27 is advised diet, physical therapy, and behavioral therapy. In addition to BMI between 27 to 30 or 27 to 29.9, you can add pharmacotherapy in the form of drugs. And anybody who has a BMI of more than 30 can also be recommended metabolic surgery. If you see, the cutoffs are slightly lower for Asian Americans because the risk is higher in this group. All right. So it is important to manage BMI so the patient is brought to ideal BMI. That is our goal of management of weight and BMI in this. So now let us talk about the other very important aspect, which is pharmacology management. So it is very simple. Patients with type 1 diabetes mellitus have absolute insulin deficiency. So there is no other way you're going to be able to treat these patients except providing them with insulin. So the insulin regimen that you use, the insulin type that you use, the insulin combinations that you use, again, depend upon access, availability, affordability. All right. So it is very important to keep that in mind. Whether you give the patient multiple daily injections of postprandial, of preprandial with the basal insulin, or you give a patient a continuous subcutaneous insulin pump, it is available for only very few classes of patients. So that decision has to be taken depending upon the patient's level of intelligence, education, access, and other things. It is always better if you're using an analog as compared to human insulin, because analogs are rapidly acting, and so you are able to achieve control better. And again, all type 1 diabetics should also be told to monitor and train their blood sugars. As far as type 2 diabetes is concerned, there are multiple drugs which are available for the management of patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus, but the cornerstone and the initial preferred agent for management of type 2 diabetes is always metformin. So please start your patients with metformin as the initial preferred pharmacological agent for all patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus. Once you have initiated metformin, you should continue it for as long as patient is able to tolerate it and there is no other contraindication to metformin. And you can keep on adding other agents to metformin. You can even add insulin to metformin. You can add other oral agents to metformin. So metformin should be included as part of your treatment, either sole or in combination treatment for all patients, unless there is an absolute contraindication to the use of metformin. And insulin should be introduced as early as possible rather than wait till the entire body sources or body stores of insulin have got depleted. Try and introduce early when the pancreatic reserve of insulin is still there, and consider these things when there is ongoing catabolism, in the sense that you started with metformin and oral agents, but there is still weight loss. And if hyperglycemia is very severe, for example, A1C is more than 10 or glucose levels are more than 300, try and start the patient on insulin itself or introduce insulin early along with metformin in these patients. However, if oral agents are failing, you will ultimately need to put your patient on insulin. So this table looks very complex. This table is available in most books, so I'm not going to go, but there are some. I've just put this table up so that you know what are the classes of drugs which are available. Of course, most important is metformin. Then you have these sulfonylureas. These are the two main groups of drugs that are used by most people for management of diabetes. And you will have known these names like glimepiride, glipizide. Earlier, glabenclamide used to be root. So these are the two sulfonylureas that are most commonly used. Also gliclazide. Thiazolidinediones, rosiglitazone, and 5-glutazone were used, but now they are generally avoided, especially in patients who have heart failure or are at risk of heart failure. Now, a very important groups that are there are your DPP-4 inhibitors, which include sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, telinagliptins, or what are called the gliptins. The gliptins are weight neutral. They have neutral effects on cardiovascular outcomes, but you have to, again, exercise precaution, especially in patients with overt heart failure. Then acarbose and voglibose have a problem with flatulence and diarrhea, and they have very few, they don't have very excessive good control of sugars. Then your other SGLT2 inhibitors like dapagliflozin, canagliflozin, empagliflozin, these are the ones which have come out in recent times, and they are favored second line of choice in type 2 diabetes, especially in those with cardiovascular disease. In fact, in many patients, in many series, you will find that in patients with cardiovascular disease, this actually is the first drug which is given along with metformin. So it is important to know all these drugs, but remember, availability, access, cost always has to be considered when you are providing medical treatment, pharmacological treatment, oral agents to your patients. Each of them has their own set of side effects, and you must keep that in mind and remember them when you are treating these patients. Don't get worried by this graph or this table. It just tells you that after healthy diet, control of weight, and adequate physical activity, which are your lifestyle modification, the first thing you will do for your patients is metformin, and reassess after 3 months whether you have been able to reach your glycemic goals or not. Depending upon what kind of glycemic goals you have three options. You can add an oral agent or a GLP-1 inhibitor, or you can add any form of insulin to these patients. So you start with metformin, and you can add on either oral agents or insulins, which could be premixed or other type of analogs, depending upon glycemic control in these patients. I'm not going to go into this in detail because you don't need to know so much. Just know that you are going to monitor your patients and keep on looking for whether or not you have been able to achieve your glycemic control. When will you consider insulin therapy in patients with diabetes? So insulin therapy should be considered in all patients who are failing to achieve glycemic targets on 3 oral agents. So this is a recommendation of RSSDI, which says that you must try 3 oral agents And if the patient is not attaining glycemic control, you must consider insulin therapy. You can actually initiate with insulin itself, especially patients who are symptomatic with severe hyperglycemia or who are in an unstable state. Many times patient comes to us referred, say, from surgical side with a large diabetic foot. So now in this patient who has a large diabetic ulcer or a diabetic foot, it is always preferable to start treatment with insulin rather than to give an oral agent and then wait. Of course, you can add metformin if there is no contraindication, but insulin should be initiated early, especially in patients who have severe hyperglycemia or who present to you in an unstable state. So for all patients who are requiring insulin, there should be an initiation with an X amount of dose depending upon requirement. You titrate that dose, up titrate or down titrate depending upon whether glycemic control is achieved or patient is having hypoglycemia. And then if patients require higher dose, you need to intensify the dose of insulin that you provide to your patients. All right, so it is very important. And so the therapeutic choice of regimen, what type of insulin, what is the delivery device, whether the patient is going to use a pen device or is going to use a simple needle and syringe, what kind of delivery device, all depends upon shared informed decision making along with the patient. Patients who are coming from poor socio-cultural backgrounds or poor socio-economic backgrounds rather may not have access to your insulin pens. Many of our patients don't even have access to refrigerators where insulin needs to be kept. So please, these are things that we need to keep in mind. We take these things for a given, but it's not true like that. We have to think of the context in which the patient is living, and we have to always modify our treatment according to that. It is always better to start with a dose of insulin which is once daily basal. For example, you can start with a glargine, or you can start with any other long-acting insulin which is given once a day, or you can give a premixed insulin with premix of intermediate acting with long acting, or twice daily premixed insulin. You can give either of these which is available, and then you can combine it with oral agents or you can combine it with metformin. Like I said, again, depending upon the patient's age, clinical features, and other risk profiles of hypoglycemia. All right. So analogs, like I said, are always preferred to human insulins because of the lower risk of nocturnal and symptomatic hypoglycemia. However, economic considerations have to be kept in mind. Insulin analogs are far more expensive than human insulins. All right. So it is very important to counsel and educate about self-monitoring blood glucose and hypoglycemia prevention, especially when you are talking to patients who are going to get started on insulin. Younger patients can be taught how to adjust their dose requirements, or if they are not eaten a meal or missed a meal, they can reduce the dose. But for that, the patient's intelligence has to be kept in mind. The patient's awareness of disease and disease control has always to be kept in mind. Many times when you tell your patients that you need to start insulin in them, they get scared. They are extremely scared. They'll say, doctor, you introduce a fourth drug for me. मैं और थोड़ा कम कर दूंगा खाना. That is not it. So insulin is not like a threat. Don't use insulin like a threat. देख लो तुम अगर दवाई नहीं खाओगे तो इंसुलिन स्टार्ट करनी पड़ जाएगी. So that is not the right attitude to advise or advocate insulin. Insulin can never be used as a threat, should never be used as a threat. Insulin is life-saving. Insulin is life-saving in acute complications. Insulin is life-saving in patients with chronic complications. So insulin has a great role to play in patients with type 2 diabetes. Yes, you can do without insulin also by giving these patients oral agents. And many patients would actually prefer oral agents to insulin, and that is acceptable. But there are good indications to start insulin, and you must start it in a timely manner rather than wait very late when it will not be of much benefit to your patient. Again, looks very complex, but assess the risk, look at the risk of hypoglycemia, see whether body weight is maintained or not, and see whether cost is a major issue before you decide on. First line will always be metformin and weight loss and other things you need to do after deciding on. So now let us look at some important other managements in patients of management of other comorbidities with patients of diabetes mellitus. The first is cardiovascular disease and risk management for that. Please remember, never forget, the blood pressure should be measured at every clinical visit. One should never forget to do that in a diabetic, even if the patient's blood pressure is under control. Patients found to have elevated blood pressure recordings of more than equal to 140 or 90 should have blood pressure confirmed with multiple readings, and all hypertensive patients with diabetes should also monitor their blood pressures also in addition to home monitoring of blood sugar. So please remember, blood pressure management is very, very critical in patients who have diabetes. You may have to give multiple drug therapy in these patients because usually their blood pressure is difficult to control. And you need to aim for blood pressure targets, and you need to give ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers as preferred drugs. So let us look at some of the recommendations that are there in persons who have BP more than 140/90 but less than 160/100. You can start with one agent along with lifestyle management. In those in whom the initial blood pressure recording itself is more than equal to 160/100, you can start two agents. And again, you look for the presence of coronary artery disease or kidney disease, that is the presence of albuminuria. If the patient has albuminuria, then you will start with one of these, either an ACE inhibitor or an ARB or a calcium channel blocker or a diuretic. And then those who have albuminuria, you will prefer to start with ACE inhibitor or ARB because these are renoprotective. Similarly, for very high blood pressure control, you will start two out of these. And for those with renal involvement, an ACE inhibitor or an ARB plus a calcium channel blocker or a diuretic. So these are the four important classes of drugs that are used for the management of patients, used for the management of blood pressure or hypertension in patients with diabetes. Please remember, for all patients of all ages with diabetes and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, high-intensity statin therapy should be added along to lifestyle intervention. Remember, the key word here is high-intensity statin. It is not 5 milligrams of atorvastatin or 5 milligrams of rosuvastatin. No, it is high-intensity statin therapy if you want to benefit. And what is high-intensity statin therapy? High-intensity statin therapy is something that lowers the LDL cholesterol by more than or equal to 50% from the baseline. That includes a dose of atorvastatin between 40 to 80 milligrams, or rosuvastatin in equivalent doses of 20 to 40, or for moderate statin therapy, atorvastatin between 10 and 20 milligrams, and rosuvastatin between 5 and 10 milligrams. So please remember that when you're looking at the lipid levels of your patient and you decide what kind of lipid lowering you require, you need to give your patient moderate to high intensity statin therapy so as to be able to achieve beneficial effects of lipid lowering with that statin therapy. Let us look at some of the microvascular complications, and also we'll talk a little bit about foot care before we end the session. So remember, hyperglycemia is at the center of all the complications of diabetes. Hyperglycemia involves the eye, or diabetes involves the eye, giving rise to diabetic retinopathy, increased risk of glaucoma and cataracts. It can give rise to diabetic neuropathy, both sensory motor as well as autonomic. It gives rise to diabetic kidney disease, nephropathy, which can manifest as diabetic nephropathy and even go on to progress to end-stage renal disease. There can be peripheral vascular diseases of the extremity, diabetic foot, and many of these things. For example, neuropathy would be a component of this. It can cause strokes, transient ischemic attacks, and cognitive impairment in patients because of vascular disease. And the most important complications of hyperglycemia are hypertension, coronary artery disease, and atherosclerosis, giving rise to cardiovascular disease and death. Patients with diabetes are at much, much higher risk of sudden cardiac death, of acute myocardial infarctions, and heart failure. So you must remember all these when you are managing a patient with diabetes, because there are so many ramifications of this one problem, which is hyperglycemia. So when do you screen for chronic kidney disease in patients with diabetes? At baseline, you have to check for the involvement of kidney in all patients, and later at least annually in patients. A spot urine to creatinine ratio and estimated GFR can be done in all patients with type 1 diabetes more than 5 years of duration, and all patients with type 2 diabetes regardless of treatment. This should be at baseline and then annually. And of course, patients who are already having 300 milligram per gram of creatinine or GFR less than 60, they should be monitored much more frequently, preferably twice a year, to guide the changes that can happen in treatment. For diabetic retinopathy, you need to optimize the glycemic control in these patients so as to reduce the risk or slow the progression of diabetic retinopathy in these patients. So these patients will need a detailed ophthalmological examination and assessment of the diabetic retinopathy at baseline, and especially when patients start complaining of blurred vision or double vision, then you need to act upon rather faster. Remember, not only do you need to control blood sugar, you also need to control and optimize blood pressure as well as lipids so as to retard or reduce the risk or slow down the progression of diabetic retinopathy. So it's not just glycemic control, it is also blood pressure control, it is also serum lipid control that needs to be done. Like I said, again, all type 1 patients 5 years after the onset of type 1 diabetes should be screened for diabetic retinopathy, and all patients with type 2 should have an initial dilated and comprehensive eye examination at the time of diagnosis. And if there is nothing in the initial examination, then annual examinations or 1 to 2 years may be considered. Of course, if a patient comes with symptoms in the intervening period of time, then you need to refer the patient to an appropriate person. Neuropathic screening. Again, type 2 diabetes should be screened with a for neuropathy at baseline. How do you screen that? You can do a very simple monofilament test in the OPD. You can check for ankle reflexes, which are very simple things to do. You don't need to get a nerve conduction velocity, simple tests. And also, if the patient is complaining of numbness, tingling, or paresthesia, it is important. You can do, like I said, simple temperature or pinprick sensations for small fiber function. You can test for vibration using a 128 Hertz tuning fork for large fiber, and also, like I said, a monofilament test to identify feet at risk for amputation. Remember, neuropathy not only is important for neuropathy itself, it is also a very, very important risk factor for developing diabetic foot. So because they have neuropathy, they are not able to initially feel the pain of small ulcers or small blisters. In addition to a vascular compromise that happens in these patients because of atherosclerosis, that blister or ulcer spreads very rapidly in the setting of poor glycemic control to give rise to severe diabetic foot. So neuropathy should be screened very, very carefully, and one must always advise these patients not to wear ill-fitting footwear. Patients should examine their feet daily while taking a bath to look whether there are any small ulcers or any patient has hurt himself or herself. Comfortable footwear needs to be worn by these patients at all times, and avoid wearing footwear that are open in the front. I mean, you don't wear peep toes. You have to cover your foot from the beginning and from the end and from all sides. That's what you normally recommend to these patients. So like I said, foot care, comprehensive foot care should be done by you every month. For patients who are having sensory loss, who have had prior amputation or ulceration, you to do it at every visit. And you should ask your patient about all these things which will increase the risk for diabetic foot, like smoking, prior vascular surgery, any other evidence of retinopathy, patient whether has renal disease or not, claudication, all these things you will ask the patient. The risk of ulcers or amputations is increased in patients who have the following risk factors: poor glycemic control, peripheral neuropathy, cigarette smoking, foot deformities, peripheral artery disease, history of foot ulcers, amputations, visual impairment, and CKD. I am not going to talk in great detail about the management of gestational diabetes mellitus because it is going to be talked about more in detail by the Obs-Gynae department. But remember two things: lifestyle behavior change is very, very important component of diabetes management, even in women with gestational diabetes. And in fact, that may be the only thing that is required for the treatment of many of these women. However, if you think that their glycemic controls are not adequate, then insulin is a preferred medication for treating hyperglycemia in gestational diabetes mellitus. All women with GDM who require pharmacological therapy should be put on insulin. Metformin and glyburide should not be used as first-line agents because both can cross the placenta into the fetus and can cause fetal abnormality. So try and initiate insulin in all these patients. So this actually is my last slide. And this last slide actually summarizes the entire thing that we have spoken today since morning. The first thing we need to do is we need to understand diabetes. We need to understand the epidemiology of diabetes and what are the types, type 1 or type 2. It is very important for us to recognize what is the type of diabetes that is there in our patient, because the rest of our monitoring and rest of our interventions are going to be based on what is the reason or what is the type of diabetes in our patient. We need to see how much severe is the extent of diabetes. And always remember, patients have so many myths, fears, anxieties, and preconceived ideas. People say that diabetes is because of rice eating. People say that diabetes is because whatever reason. So there are so many preconceived, ill-conceived notions, ideas that patients come to you with. You have to address them. You may need to explain the patient so many things. It is very devastating when an adolescent comes to you at the age of 14, 15, 17 with diabetes, and then you say that this person is going to require insulin injections for the rest of his or her life. It is a very difficult thing for that person as well as his or her parent to understand, explain, and accept. So it is important for us to remember that we have to explain and counsel to our patients about all these things. There are so many recent advances that have happened in diabetes. We need to keep ourselves tuned to them. We need to know what are the newer pharmacological agents that are available. We need to know what are the adverse effects of some of these pharmacological interventions and treatments, and we need to be aware of all these things. The next important thing to consider in patients with diabetes are blood glucose targets or glycemic targets and monitoring. So for that, we need to know what are the normal levels, and we need to know what are the glucose targets. Remember, there are certain glucose targets that are recommended by many guidelines. Like I told you about the American Diabetes Association guidelines. I told you about the RSSDI guidelines. They all will give you a guideline as to what is the preferred or the recommended range of glycemic control. But remember that this glycemic control has to be individualized in many circumstances. You may accept a lower glycemic control or a poorer control, especially in older patients, those with complications, those who are not able to take care of themselves. So remember, you may need to modify your glycemic targets depending upon the context of the patient that you're dealing with. The very important thing to remember is self-monitoring of blood glucose. It is a very, very empowering strategy. The patient is himself or herself responsible for monitoring their blood sugar, and so you are able to get patients who adhere more to your strategies. Continuous glucose monitoring may be required in some intensive situations, like in the ICUs or some other situations. So that is another thing that can be there. One must decide on the frequency of monitoring. How frequently does the patient need to be seen? How frequently does the lab test need to be repeated? And whether there are any other special conditions or situations that need to be monitored, assessed, and reassessed and reviewed each time the patient comes in. So this is very important, setting the targets. Then comes management of diabetes. In management of diabetes, you start with dietary planning. You plan out the diet for the patient depending upon patient's weight, BMI, social context. Then you advise exercise, which could be active exercises, yoga. Then you may have to give oral medications or injectable medication for the management of diabetes. That is one of the most important management that is there. Whether you're going to give oral agents, if you're going to give oral agents, which ones, once a day, twice a day, how do you increase the dose, how do you decrease the dose, when will you start insulin, how much insulin, which insulin, how do you up titrate or down titrate the insulin, what all will you monitor in these patients, and how do you make sure the patient is sticking to your recommendations. Remember, there are many diverse situations that you meet in your life while treating these patients. These patients go on fasts, like for example, during Ramzan, patients will go on fasts for a long period of time. How do you manage diabetes in such situations? There are fasts in Hindu cultures also. Patients go on fasts. How do you monitor blood sugars? So you need to think of all these things when you are advising your patient treatment strategies. Patients travel, so they will ask you, should I take my insulin earlier? Should I take it later? Can I carry it in my bag? Can I carry it in my purse? So all kinds of things you have to keep in mind, and you may need to discuss these things with your patient. The biggest problems with diabetes, of course, are diabetes complications. Diabetes involves almost all systems, like I told you. So you need to educate it can involve the foot, it can involve the heart, there can be ocular complications. You need to take care of the foot care education for the patient. There may be sexual dysfunction which patients may not tell you initially, but later on, at a later date, when they have more confidence in you, then they may reveal that they actually have autonomic sexual dysfunction. Then there are multiple micro and macrovascular complications, the renal one being the most dreaded because it is now the most common cause of end-stage kidney disease in the world. Fatty liver is also a very, very important association of diabetes. We need to know how to prevent them, how to screen for them, if you screen for them, what to do for them. So diabetes complications are very important. These are all only the chronic complications that we have talked about. There's a whole list of acute complications that is especially seen in patients with type 1 also, or sometimes in type 2 also, especially diabetic ketoacidosis, with which type 1 diabetics can present. Type 2 diabetics also have a very severe hyperglycemic complication, which is called non-ketotic hyperosmolar coma, or HONC, which is just called. Also, a lot of these patients can have hypoglycemia. So it is very important to be aware of the acute complications as well, because many times patient can present in an unconscious state, and so you don't know whether this patient is having a hypoglycemia or a hyperglycemia. So blood sugar monitoring initially is very, very crucial. Then always remember that there are special populations who require additional support and our hand-holding through their process of treatment. These include adolescents, these include the very elderly, and we also need to do some amount of preconception counseling. Patients may have questions, and if I am diabetic type 1, if I am diabetic type 2, what is the likelihood that my child will also be diabetic? So you need to address many such kind of questions. Address all other comorbidities or co-infections or associations the patients may have. Remember, diabetes is not just a simple disease of giving an oral agent. Most patients or most physicians and most people also think that if you have diabetes, you will need one oral agent like glimepiride or metformin or a combination of the two, and then that's it. No, it is a very, very complex disease with multiple organ system involvement. Each of them requires several levels of monitoring. Each of them have their own goals. Blood pressure monitoring is so crucial in these patients. Evaluation for heart disease is so crucial in these patients. So evaluation of foot care. Many of these patients require amputations, which can be limb threatening. Sometimes they're even life threatening. So remember, diabetes is a disease which has multiple potential ramifications for the patient. The patient needs to understand that, the physician needs to understand that, and together you will be able to achieve better control of all your parameters of diabetes mellitus. I'm going to stop here. I am unfortunately, we cannot take questions. Otherwise, this would have been a really, really wonderful way for a two-way lecture where people can ask questions about diabetes and we can then do that kind of a one-to-one interaction. Anyway, what we will do is I have given you an introduction into diabetes. Whenever college reopens, and it will reopen, and then when we meet in a small teaching, we can again go back to teaching and learning diabetes, because it is going to come back again and again. So I'm going to end with this slide, and thank you very much for attending. Goodbye.